All right, so we are going to cover in this screencast essentially climate and the prevailing productivity based on the climate in an area. So we're going to be looking at questions to consider 6 through 10. Um, so you need to be able to define climate, and I want you to be able to outline kind of the general characteristics of a handful of biomes. We'll look at those a little bit more closely. And you also then need to be able to talk about how does the climate impact the productivity of an area. So the primary productivity, how much photosynthesis is happening, how much plant biomass is gathering in a certain period of time. So those are kind of the key components. You'll dig down and answer these questions in a little bit. Okay, so first of all, we have, if we're looking at climate, this is the understanding that the IB puts out there, that the type of stable ecosystem that will emerge in an area is predictable based on climate. Okay, well, first of all, let's look at what climate means. Climate, that is the region's long-term atmospheric conditions. It's not the daily weather, but it's long-term conditions. That's looking at seasonality. Are there seasons? Are there dry seasons? Are there wet seasons? So it's long-term. It's not just what's the weather today. And the three main factors that govern climate are temperature, and that temperature, like year-round, is it cold during some parts of the year, warm during other parts of the year? Is it consistently cool, consistently hot? So it's looking at temperature not on a daily basis, but more on like an average annual, what's going on, seasonality, and some patterns in the temperature. That goes for precipitation as well. Are there patterns in precipitation? How much precipitation does it get? And lastly, something that actually influences the other two pretty strongly is insolation. So how much sunlight, how direct are the sunlight rays that you're getting? Because right at the equator, the sunlight rays are very strong. As you move further away from the equator, the strength of the sunlight, even though we have these longer days in summer, the strength of the sunlight still is not as strong as if the sun were directly overhead, if you were closer, to the equator in between the tropics. And of course, more light means more photosynthesis. And so that's why we don't get tropical rainforests here. Okay, so that's the definition of climate. And a biome itself is a collection of ecosystems that share similar climatic conditions. So, you might have a tropical biome that has resulted in South America and another one, say in Asia, and they share climatic similarities, right? They have similar year-round warm temperatures, similar lots of rainfall, and similar insolation, very direct rays. And because of those prevailing climatic conditions, the tropical rainforests are what appear. So you get a lot of vegetation, and it's very dense and high productivity. Okay. Now they're probably different species, right? Because they've evolved differently. They're different species that have evolved there, but they've both been adapting. Those ecosystems have been adapting to those tropical rainforest type climatic conditions. Okay. So we'll come back and look at this climate graph in a little bit, but you will need to be able to interpret a climate graph. Okay. So the biomes that I think would probably be the easiest to talk your way through, and you're gonna need, you can pause this if you want and go look at the question to consider, and I give you a link to the Pearson book that has kind of a table of a lot of the biomes. But I think if you were to start at the equator and walk your way north and or south, it doesn't, as long as you're walking away from the equator, these tropical biomes get really high insolation, and that's why they tend to exist. Coral reefs, tropical coral reefs, tropical rainforests, those all exist usually are not too far from the equator. Strong insolation, a lot of sunlight, a lot of productivity. That also creates some pressure systems that allows for a whole lot of rainfall too. So there's a lot of rainfall, there's high temperatures all year round. And because of that, you get this really, really high productivity, lots of insolation, right? As you move away from the equator, then that's actually when you start to hit the deserts. And the deserts, as you know, they have very little precipitation. And that's generally the definition of a desert, is that it gets low precipitation. There are such things as polar deserts. So it doesn't necessarily have to be hot, but the ones that fall, kind of the ones that we know of from whether it's the Sahara, that's generally going to be somewhere around the Tropic of Cancer, or then down here a little bit further south. Here's the Atacama Desert. So it's around 30 degrees. And there's still pretty good sunlight happening, pretty decent insulation in those specific deserts. And the temperatures can be pretty warm, but it actually turns out they can be pretty cool at night because the vegetation isn't there because of the water. So because they have not a lot of productivity because there's not enough water for photosynthesis to occur, that without that water there, it's not going to hold on to the temperatures at night. So once it cools down, once the sun goes down, it cools down pretty quickly. And then as you keep moving further north, you get to the temperate forests. We live in a temperate forest. It's kind of a mixed conifer deciduous forest, and you get all these deciduous forests in the northeast of the United States, and you get some nice temperate conifer forests as you're around the Pacific Northwest, and you can see through Europe it tends to be a nice temperate forest. Okay, and these temperate forests have similar characteristics too. They generally get enough rainfall to be able to support trees, but they might have a little bit more seasonality to them in a lot of the temperate forests because there's the insulation changes. So we don't get very much sunlight during the winter, but we get a lot more sunlight during the summer. And there should be enough rainfall to be able to support trees. But then as you move further and further north, you get to the taiga. So this is the taiga, the way north conifer forest that you think of, they're fairly small conifer trees. It tends to, not get a lot of insulation, and it can be frozen much of the year. But it does get just enough precipitation to be able to support trees, unlike the tundra. So the tundra is where you're going to get very low insulation, cold temperatures almost year round. And those temperatures don't ever get warm enough so the underlayers can't support, they don't actually thaw. So there's no permafrost. So there's this permafrost never melts. So you always get like a layer of frozen soil underneath. And so there's not a lot of sunlight. Again, it doesn't get very big vegetation because one, it doesn't have access to much water because it tends to be frozen. And number two, the temperatures are too cold for a lot of photosynthesis. Like the enzymes aren't going to be working at their optimal temperatures. So you need to be able to kind of outline those prevailing characteristics in these biomes. And that's going to help you then when you're starting to look at the productivity here in a little bit, which of those factors are helping or inhibiting productivity. Okay, so you need to be able to do a climate graph. And in this climate graph, you should be able to look at this climate graph and be able to tell, if you were given some factors, which type of prevailing biome would exist there. So here's an example question from the Oxford book. So determine the types of ecosystems which can exist where a mean annual precipitation level of 175 centimeters exists. So let's go to the precipitation, and you can notice if we're looking at 175, that's going to be about there. If this were on paper, you should use a ruler. On the IB exam, they're very particular about how specifically you can read a graph. So if we are at 175, so which types of ecosystems? So we would move north and we would be able to have tropical deciduous forest, temperate deciduous forest. Looks like maybe it just crosses into a little temperate rainforest, and then up to the tundra. Okay. You notice, by the way, the y-axis here, on not all climate graphs, but on this particular one, so pay attention to your y-axis, the temperature is going in this direction. It's getting warmer. Here's another example question. And if you want to pause it and see if you can answer it before I give you the answer, go ahead. And you want to determine the range of conditions under which tropical rainforest will form. So here's tropical rainforest. So you would want to put your ruler from, just maybe that's 245 centimeters to whatever's behind my head over there, 440 centimeters of rainfall. And then you would want to then measure, it's got to be somewhere between like 18 or 19 degrees to closer to 30. Okay. So like 28 degrees. So within that kind of box of parameters is where you would find the tropical rainforest. Here's another example question. Other variables that likely influence the type of stable ecosystem that forms. Other variables that you might think about is how close are you to the ocean? Because, if you live near the ocean, it's generally because the water can absorb a lot of heat, and that you're going to have a more temperate climate rather than if you're right in the middle of a continent. Elevation, obviously, because that's going to impact temperature. Which side of the mountains are you on? If you're on the coastal side of the mountains, you might get a lot of rainfall, whereas if on the other side of the mountains, you might be in what's called a rain shadow. So there's a lot of other things that might influence the local prevailing climate. But we're just going to stick with generally just these generalities to get us through. Okay, another cool example is looking at these climate graphs. So if you were to look at these 5 different ones, could you classify them as which type of biome? So you can see this one, look at the temperature. It's way above freezing almost all year long, but there's not very much rainfall. So, what would that one be? And so I want you to take a minute, hit pause, and see if you can guess what each of them are, and then I'll give you the answers. Okay, so the first one is the tropical desert. And I say tropical desert simply because it's closer to the equator. There are deserts that are, further north that don't have such high temperatures, or further south as well. Okay, so, and then this next one, look, we get some reasonable amount of rain. It looks like it gets really cold in some parts of the year and really warm in other parts of the year, or fairly warm in other parts. So it looks like there's some seasonality happening here, especially with temperature, right? So maybe that could be something similar to where we live, but it's not, because it doesn't get enough, we're not far enough north, because that's way, way, way below freezing, okay? So in this case, we've got the tundra, not very much rainfall and huge swings in temperature, but again, look at how warm it actually gets. It's only getting up to about 15, whereas it gets way down below -20. The next one is tropical rainforest. I'm sure you could have guessed that. Hot temperatures all year long and lots of rain. Now here's one, the taiga. So this looks similar to this one, but notice that the temperature isn't quite as high or quite as low. And then here is probably a little bit more similar to where we live. It doesn't generally get below freezing very often. It might be down here. If we were to look at the Prague one, we'd probably see it average close to freezing maybe. And then, it can spike up into the warmer temperatures closer to 30 and then back down, but there's still enough rainfall to support all those trees. So these are just some examples. Okay. The next thing we need to talk about is productivity, and that's the total gain in energy or biomass per unit area per unit time. So what that means, if you take, let's say, 1 square meter of the forest out here in Devokasharka, if we were to measure how much energy was fixed, like through photosynthesis, this is primary productivity, how much energy was fixed through photosynthesis in 1 year. So you'd have to measure essentially how much energy that is. You could measure it with biomass or measure the amount of oxygen that's being taken in or carbon dioxide being produced. But if you kind of measured the sunlight energy that's being converted to the chemical energy of plants through photosynthesis, if you could measure how much of that was happening in 1 square meter in 1 year, that is productivity. So it's the total gain in energy or biomass per unit area per unit time, okay? And so we're going to focus mostly on primary productivity, but you can talk about productivity in general, because the more primary productivity you have, the more plants and the more food there is to support the next trophic level. So, and the next trophic level and the next trophic level. So secondary productivity is when you're focusing on consumers. But the more primary productivity you have, generally, the more organisms at all the other trophic levels that can be supported. And certain biomes are more productive than others, right? So you can see net productivity of the tropical rainforest is way higher than the desert. And so the tundra is going to be way down here too. This is another example of productivity too, right? So the biggest one is like the tropical reefs and the tropical rainforests have a ton of productivity. But the things that don't, desert, tundra. And so you need to be able to describe which climatic factors or what things are affecting the productivity. So if you're looking at the tropical forest has all of those things that it needs. It has tons and tons of insulation. It has lots of water. It's warm all year round, so the enzymes can work efficiently. And so that's why it's going to have so much productivity. All those things that are favorable for photosynthesis. Whereas if you go down to the desert, it's the water that's the limiting factor, right? And so the photosynthesis can't happen without water. That's one of the reactants that need to go into that equation. And so, if you're looking at the tundra, the temperatures are too low and there's not a lot of water accessible because it's frozen. So, and the insulation, there's not enough light for photosynthesis to occur. So you should be able to kind of talk your way through those limiting factors to be able to talk about the different biomes.